Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I am Rebecca Beardsall and I am so excited that you're here with me today. This is a space for us to investigate books. It is a way for us to look at the ways that stories reflect back to us, reflect ourselves, reflect the world around us, show how we are connected in bigger ways than we even realized. And it's also a way to look at the way an author unfurls the story, the techniques and methodologies that they use to tell a story. And it is just an opportunity for us to just look at new books or books out there that I'm reading. And today I would like to talk to you about Katherena Vermette's Real Ones. So just to give you a little background of what the book is about, there are two sisters that we follow through here, June and Lynn, and their mother, Renee, has been claiming to be Raven Bearclaw. She's claiming to be Indigenous when she is not. And then we look at what the repercussions of that is on the family who actually is Indigenous. So her daughters are via their father. And so the kind of backlash that happens in social media and in media in general when this news comes out about their mother. And so I'm just going to read a couple little quotes on this section of the book about this theme, but this is not really what I want to talk to you about, what I found really dynamic about the book as a whole, but to just kind of show you a little bit about the premise and the kind of heart of what the book is kind of using to tell a bigger story, I feel. So this quote is on page 31, and let me confirm who is, so this is under June, and she says, "But it's like he heard. How many times do we have to say it? That Métis actually means a whole people with a history, language, culture, and years of struggle. These fakers don't get to have all that because of what? A family story, a spit test, because they what? Feel it's true? No, no way. None of that is what being Indigenous means. But of course, explaining that becomes the work of actual Indigenous people again." I think that kind of sums up some of the conversations that happening when Renee is exposed as Raven Bearclaw. And the other quote that I wanted to do here, because I think this was an interesting scenario and kind of telling us a little bit about where Renee came from. So Renee came from a Mennonite French family. And this is in the story. How we get the story told to us is chapter by chapter, June or Lynn. And this is Lynn speaking, and she says, this is on page 42, "Do you remember this one time Grandma was telling us that she was French now and not Menno anymore because of who she married?" And in some way, this is what Renee does, right? She at one point was married to an Indigenous person, and she then claimed that she was Indigenous. And on top of that, what was really destructive is that she took his story and claimed it as her own. So the racism that he experienced from her family, she said, was how she was addressed. So she not only claimed that she was Indigenous, she then actually stole the stories of her former husband as well as her daughters. So I think this is where it's very complicated in this way that it's affecting the family as well. And what was interesting about this, and so I'm looking at page 82 as my other note, was that this is June talking, and June in here is a character that is in academia, and her sister Lynn is an artist. And so in this way that Renee became Raven Bearclaw, was basically she took on artwork that and claimed that she was Indigenous and got grants and got faculty placement and things like that from her work. And so on either side of that, you have an academic as well as an artist in her children who are actually Indigenous doing this work, and that their mother is the one that got all the money and all the accolades and awards, but actually isn't Indigenous. And so at one point, June's talking about this idea that um, how she's feeling in her place in academia. And she says, so they're talking to each other, and who knows, she gets these awards, these accolades, and you wouldn't want that. And she says, I know, but it's not, it, I just don't get the thinking. I mean, I can't get over my imposter syndrome in anywhere. I always think I'm a fraud, that people will see through me and know that I'm full of shit. And then because of this, and she says, well, this has made it worse. But that's how I've always felt, just a stupid kid from Winnipeg who has no business being a professor doing professor things. And so it's just kind of interesting, this idea that imposter syndrome and how she's feeling about her place in academia, when she actually has all the education behind her, all the work behind her, and should be feeling confident in that space, but isn't. And there's her mother just claiming something that's not hers. And finally, the last quote I want to do on this one is on page 168. And I think this was a really insightful quote for me about, what Renee was doing and claiming to be something that she was not. And I believe this is June again. Yes, is talking about how Renee did have culture and she did have some really interesting things about her life, right? The French, the Mennonite. And so this is the quote. I love those stories. One day I'd like to explore them in full because they are also my own. It's a rich, colorful, surprising, exceptional culture in its own right. By taking our stories, she is effectively discrediting her own and those of her actual ancestors. And that's sad to me. That's a missed opportunity. And I thought that was such a profound thing for this character to say, and also for the writer to put in there, in a way that Renee tried to take on something else so that she could get the awards and be able to be who she thought she wanted to be or who she was. Or there is conversation in here about trauma and mental illness in that space. But it was also saying she had heritage and ancestral stuff and things that were actually something she could claim, and she didn't do that. She went in a different direction. So I thought that was just an interesting way that this character brought that up, as well as the author putting that in there. Now, while that is the big premise of the book itself, and I feel like I really brushed over it, but that is the heart of this. This is why we're in this story of these two siblings and the people around them. But that is what I really found fascinating, was the sibling relationship that we watch. And so in some ways, it really is this connection and this view into sibling, especially sister dynamic. And I love the way that throughout we get to see the sisters have love, and also in some way frustration, and then sometimes how they show their love is by that hard truth telling, which then makes the other person defensive and angry, and then it allows for this space for miscommunication. So in some ways, it's like every sibling out there, right? But it's, well, not every, but some of the dynamics of siblings, right? Where there's miscommunication at every level. And that was the other interesting thing I thought I saw here, and it was a beautiful way of showing how this happens, is that the difference of the two. right? There's some similarities, but then there's also difference. And it's in that difference that we see that misunderstanding, right? We come at it, and the characters come at it with their lens, and they can see, what's going on from their lens, but not seeing it from the others. And so by getting both stories, you're hearing both of that, and then you're also seeing it and the complexity of that. So the one quote I wanted to have on that was on page 90. So what was that one? Oh, and this isn't actually really a quote, but it's like, it was a conversation between the two, and the one says, "Why do you care?" And the other said, "Why don't you care?" And it, like, there's moments like that throughout that it really is just that sibling kind of like, I'm frustrated with you, like, why are you being so different to me, but I love you because you're my sister, but I am so frustrated by you. And I think that Vermette does a wonderful job really showing that dynamic and really letting us see like that sibling relationship, and how something like this with their mother complicates things. Yeah, and so the other one I wanted to quote in this idea of difference and misunderstanding is in 294. So getting close to the end. Oh, yeah, this one was good. So once again, they're having a conversation, the two sisters, and this is their conversation. So the one says, "I know you're not perfect, but your life looks pretty perfect." And then the other one says, "What about your life? You're free. You could absolutely go anywhere, do anything, take your kid and have an adventure. You're so expletive, full of freedom, and you stay here." And again, that looking at the other person's life and what they're seeing and how they're seeing that, oh, your life is perfect. No, your life is perfect. And while that happens in general with people, it is really telling and difficult with siblings. Because in some way, and although we try not to think about it as siblings, there is a general competition, right? For parents' affection, for attention, for, wanting to be the best in the family. And then on top of that, just seeing what your other siblings are doing and feeling like you're not reaching that space. And so once again, I just felt like this was a beautiful way of sharing that. The other dynamic that we see within the two siblings, that is this feeling of not only when they're in conflict, but also feeling that they need to protect each other, that they need to be there for each other, or they need to like help them through whatever's going on. And even though they're frustrated and they don't want to talk to each other, it is part of it. And so this quote that I want to share is on 137, and this is June, and she's looking at her sister Lynn and her kind of taking in and holding her daughter Willow, as they're been upset by this whole thing with Renee claiming to be Raven Bearclaw. And June says, "I'm insanely jealous of this mothering. I want to go up too. I want to say sorry, 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 but I turn and walk into my new old house instead. Give my dad an excited look like I am excited." And I think there's this space there that the two, having a mother like Renee in this, and I'm not going to go into all those details, but her basically not raising them or caring about them in some way, and always being thinking about herself, that these two women now are still in this mothering state for each other, and that they continue to look to each other as someone they need to take care of, but also then frustrated and kind of annoyed by having to do that, right? So this is early on in their life growing up. Um, this is June again, and talking about the dynamic between her parents when they were young and when they were still married and before they separated. And she said, Renee napping for days, that's when I would have to step up and help with Lynn. Lynn is the younger one. That's when Dad would wake me up before he went to work to tell me he put milk in our cups in the fridge, so I had to be careful getting it out and pouring it on our cereal. He'd tell me he'd be back when the hands on the clock were straight up and down, and to stay in the yard when we got home. And so June had to step up into this space to be the mother. And then in some way, the life that Lynn had with Renee, she in turn had to be the mother for Renee, and try to protect her in that place. And 125. Okay. So this is when Lynn, who at the time when they separated, June stayed with her dad and Lynn went with Renee, and she always felt like that was, kind of what she was supposed to do. And at one point later in the book, June's like, I should have just gone with her and not stayed where I wanted to stay with Dad in my room and everything that I had. I should have gone with Renee. But at one point, Lynn is at her dad's house, and she overhears her dad and her stepmom talking, and she finds there that Renee is only keeping Lynn because she can't pay child support. And Lynn hears her dad say, well, that was the deal. We each get one. She doesn't have any money, Cal. And so it's this, to realize in that space and to know that she heard that, is that her mom really didn't want her with her. It's that she didn't have money to pay for child support. And so that was the deal that they made. And so that was why Lynn, kind of got into this space where being with Renee and, moving from place to place, and Renee having violent relationships, which would affect Lynn. In addition to that, Renee would just go off and get some grant and just disappear. And Lynn would have to go live back with her dad. And then Renee would come back and be like, oh, I lost that job. We're going to go do this now. And so she'd move back. So it was this constant moving back and forth between the two that is part of that. So with the sibling relationships, we see this love, this truth-telling, this frustration. We see how their differences, is what leads to their misunderstandings. This also this protection that needs to happen. The other interesting thing about this, and this is so true in any relationships, but it's particularly interesting in sibling relationships, is how they can view the other from the outside, but have the inside knowledge, right? Because instead of it being a friend and going, oh, I know why they're doing that because they always do that. As siblings, you've experienced in some way similar life, or at least know more about the dynamics of the family. And so you can look at what's going on and go, oh, yeah, that's right. That's because of mom, or that's just like mom, or, whatever that is. And so we have those elements in here as well. And so this one, this quote that I want to share with you is on page 200, and this is June again, and she's talking to her grandmother, and they're talking about Renee, and this is the grandmother saying, I know she had her challenges, and that's for sure. I always thought she was so sad, that one, like she didn't know how to be happy, would wreck everything just to prove that she didn't deserve it. Your sister's like that, hey. And that, I think, again, is this inside knowledge, right? Like we see that in Renee, we see that in Lynn, grandma sees it, June sees it. It's a way of having that inside knowledge. And this is where that truth telling and that hard love in some way comes out and is shown to each of the characters. And so there's many moments throughout that we see this kind of push-pull of the relationship of the two sisters, which was just so good. And so this, it comes back to June and she's talking to her dad, and in this way they're talking about Renee again, and he says, I know, Junie, but so did she, hey? I don't think she ever had a chance to grow up. This is Renee they're talking about, not all the way, and I feel bad for her really. And this is June, I nod. I don't know if it's an agreement or only acknowledgement, but it feels like the right thing to do. And once again, this is a space that you get more inside knowledge. Her dad obviously had a different relationship with Renee. They fell in love. They were young. They had children. Like the space where the children were just kind of experiencing that, and the dynamics weren't in the adult relationship and the knowing, but that knowing comes later. And this also kind of gives other insight. So again, the premise of the book is about pretendians, right? But I just love the way that this book showed us into that sibling relationship and that push-pull dynamic, that love, I don't want to say hate, but that love and frustration that we have with siblings. And I just felt like it was a good investigation and a lens into sibling dynamics. One of the other things that I really liked about this, and it was really in some way short, in some way, a little element of this book, was this returning and leaving home. This idea of this ongoing push-pull of place, of belonging, of not quite belonging. And so in this book, at the beginning, June and her niece are in Vancouver, and they're moving back east. And June has this wonderful kind of these wonderful moments, and so I am the opposite. So maybe this is just also why I like this. So I am also from the East Coast. I'm from Pennsylvania, but I live in Washington, which is basically near Vancouver, and so I could really feel this, right? That she talks about, this is June. I felt restless for the mountains didn't start settling until they took up the whole view. It was only then that I could breathe a bit. And the other one is when she kind of shares the story of the trip, of what it means to travel back east. And so she starts telling you this whole story about when you're going west from Winnipeg, you start to see, these evergreens, you start to see the grasses, you start to see the Rockies, and then the mountains appear. And the quote is, going east is all that in reverse, anticlimactic, downhill, backwards. And I think, for the character, I think going home in some way felt reassuring. She was able to have a house and not be in an apartment, and then she had this good job there at the university. But there was something about taking her from the environment where she felt like that she could breathe to the environment of home, and that constant push pull of where you belong and where you're from, kind of some way in that space. It's something I've investigated in my own writing, of that push pull of belonging, and the way that place kind of like has an entity in some way, and once you once you home, or once you in the other home, or you're this kind of push pull in that way. I had one other note here. I'll see what that was about. Oh, this was on 193. Once again, June, just basically, if I'm honest and I'm trying to be, my real home is a rented duplex in Berkshire Bay. And so again, just that idea of home and what that means. And I think especially for these two women, home was complicated. And so it was just really interesting that June kind of took us in that space in there. So the other thing I want to talk about this book that I thought was really fascinating was the storytelling methodology that the author used. So as I mentioned, we have the two sisters. June's older, Lynn's younger, and every other chapter is one or the other. So we're hearing the story through them, the lens through them. They take us back to their history, or where they are currently. In addition, we get text messages. So we have some of the chapters start, whether it's June or Lynn. Mostly Lynn has the text messages. And so that's how we get to hear other characters' voices, by what they are texting to Lynn or what they're texting to June. And so we have Willow, we have Auntie Dell, we have Grandma Jeannie, I think that's how you say it, Yo-Yo, Dad, obviously Renee, and then June's colleague, who's never named. And so I just thought that was another interesting way. Not only do we get their voice through dialogue that June and Lynn share, but we actually get their text messages. And so there are idiosyncrasies in that space of, do they use punctuation, full sentences? Do they use emojis? Do they use memes? That whole thing. And I just love that element of it that they had in, that the author used in there. The other way we get storytelling is through social media comments. So the story of Renee in this, as a pretendian, right, like has this big blowout on social media as the story gets out there. And so how that affects the two sisters as well as the rest of the family. But then also we get to see some of that back and forth, and what people are actually saying. Like we have, a name of somebody and then what they put up there. So it's another way that we're hearing story. And then there's also letters that are sent. So we see letters, and voicemails is another thing that we kind of get like a transcript from, essentially, that we're also reading. So the other thing another way that narrative is shared in this is via art. So Renee is an artist, right? This is where how she's using her claimed Indigenous artwork, right? But Lynn is an artist. And so I love some of the places in here of how art is talked about. And so it was really, again, interesting to have the academia and artist space in here. And I love that this was a way that Lynn was expressing herself and how she was thinking, and, while June was so obsessed about, what this kind of, I just lost the word. What this like fallout would be of like this story getting out about their mom, Lynn was really kind of pushing into the space of artwork. And so I have a quote here on 65. Oh yeah. So this is Lynn. And she's a potter. And she's just kind of talking about what she's doing in space. She also paints. So she's saying that the art is only healing when you think no one is watching. Once you do it for other people, it ceases to be yours. It becomes theirs for them. And that's okay. It's giving. It's a gift to the world and for their healing. But you, the artist, you are then the healer, not the healed. I just thought that was a really interesting and insightful thing that the character kind of brought into this space. And the other one about art with Lynn. So I think this is where, again, talking about how stories told and how we're pulled along into the narrative. While it's very obvious when you're looking at their stories and you're reading what they're sharing with you. You're looking at text messages. You're looking at like written social media posts, etc., letters, voicemails. There's something about this space of art that has its own voice. It has its own way of providing a narrative that often gets overlooked in book form. Not in other spaces, but in book form it often does. And so I think that's what I loved so much about how art was handled in this book, from how it was created to some of the instances where she's working with kids with art, or she's out and placing her art into the world and what that looks like. I just felt that was a really insightful way that Vermette did that. And so this quote is on page 160. I think the whole point of art is to see. Maybe you see what the artist wants you to see. Maybe you see something else. Doesn't matter. We really only ever see ourselves anyway. Anything we read or hear, books, sculptures, painting, music, is only what we are, us reflected back to us. Who cares what the artist intended as long as you got something out of it? And I was like, yes. I think about this in books. This is often what I talk about in this space, is how it reflects back to us, what we're seeing in it. And it's even things I talk to my coaching clients, and I even had to say about my own book, like it's not for everybody. Some people are going to love it. Other people are going to hate it. That's fine. That like you're not there to like walk alongside them and read it with them to say, this is what I meant here, and this is what I meant here, and oh no, you misunderstood, this is what I meant. It is really for us to take and see and experience. And I'm just going to add this as a note, because this is something that Lynn did as a character throughout, that she doesn't use commas in lists. I don't know what that's about. And I like, part of me wants to really investigate this. But then part of me is like, I'm not writing a paper on this right now. But like that list of book, sculpture, paintings, music has no commas in it. And at first it was one of those things where I was like, what is happening? Was it a typo? And it's like, no, Lynn does not use commas when she's using a list. So that's a little insight to her as a character. Again, like I said, I would love to really dive into that and investigate that. I think the other thing that was just apparent in this book is basically humanness, like the messiness of life, in relationships, in families, in careers. It's just a lovely kind of insight into, or a way to just walk alongside these two women in their lives and experience just that, the messiness of being human. There's one scene in here, and I'm going to say this because I have worked in academia for 15 plus years. And the scene in academia, like when she goes to the new school, oh, it was so cringe. It was so cringe. And I think it's just in some way the reality of the space right now. I'm not going to go into it all. I'm going to encourage you to read the book. And then my last and final note, and I had a bunch more that I wanted to talk about Lynn and her growing up with Renee, but I think I got to the bulk of that. But my one last note that I think it was early on. Oh gosh, was it like the first sentence? Let me double check. Anyway, I don't know where it was, but it was early on that June talked about her time in Aotearoa. And I loved that this book used Aotearoa and never used the colonizer name of New Zealand. And throughout, never use New Zealand, use Aotearoa. And I just love that so much. So thank you, Katherena Vermette, for doing that, and using the Maori name for New Zealand, Aotearoa. It was beautiful. So again, I would highly recommend Katherena Vermette's Real Ones. For me, I couldn't get it in the U.S. at the time, so I did get it from Canada. Thank you, Massey Books in Vancouver, for shipping to the U.S. and being so close to my home. But it will probably be in the U.S. soon if it's not by the time this posts. So I do encourage you to look at it. It was a really interesting, thought-provoking novel that challenged the way we look at art, the way we look at academia, and then the way we look at siblings and those kind of relationships in that space, and what it means to just be a human in this world. And like that last quote, in some way we get out of it what we see in ourselves. So like the perfect example was how I just love that concept of the east to west and the west to east, because that's my experience as well. And so it would be something that I would hone in on and go, oh, that was nice. So anyway, it was a beautiful book. Thank you so much for joining me today for Lit Illuminated, and I hope to see you soon.